Welcome to a legendary clash from the 23rd World Championship. It's the magician from Riga, Mihail Tal, against the Iron Patriarch of Soviet chess, Mikhail Botvinnik. Tal opens with pawn to e4, and Botvinnik meets him with the solid French defense. We enter the sharp Winauer variation as both sides develop logically, building a tense classical pawn structure in the center. And here it is, classic Tal, pawn to a3, a brilliant pawn sacrifice. He's not just asking a question, he's throwing down a gauntlet. The idea is to force black to capture on c3, after which the pawn recaptures, opening the b-file for his rook and bolstering his central control. Botvinnik accepts the challenge, taking the knight on cell3 with check. Tal recaptures with the pawn, the only move to keep the pressure on, and immediately swings his queen out to g4, putting the heat on black's kingside. Botvinnik is under pressure and has a critical decision to make. He needs to find a way to untangle his kingside, but the move he chooses actually weakens his pawn structure. The much stronger try was developing the knight to e7. The queen would snatch the pawn on g7, the rook slides to g8, the queen grabs another pawn on h7, and black gets counterplay by taking on d4. But in the game, Botvinnik pushes the pawn to f5, and while it challenges white's queen, it creates long-term weaknesses around his king. Tal's queen sidesteps to g3. Black develops the knight, but now the white queen goes on a raid, first taking the pawn on g7, then after the rook defends, grabbing the pawn on h7 as well. Amid the chaos, Tal calmly tucks his king away to d1, while Botvinnik develops his bishop. The white queen gives a check from h5, forcing black's knight to g6. Tal calmly reroutes his own knight to e2, and Botvinnik creates a headache with the disruptive pawn push to di3. And Tal responds with the best move on the board, pawn takes pawn on d3. This is the only way to keep a firm grip on the advantage, liquidating the central tension on his own terms. Botvinnik tries to create distractions with bishop to a4 check, but Tal's king is perfectly safe, calmly stepping over to e1. And here, Botvinnik makes a costly decision. He sees a pawn, and he takes it, but this allows Tal's pieces to flood into the game. A much better plan was to keep the tension. Pushing the pawn to d4 was the move. After the pawns are exchanged, the knight comes to c6, white develops the bishop to e3, and black could castle queenside into a complex fighting game. Back in the actual game, though, Botvinnik's queen snaps up the pawn on e5, a temporary gain for long-term pain, as white's attack is about to become overwhelming, and Tal wastes no time. The bishop comes out to g5, the d-pawn marches to d4, seizing the center, and the h-pawn advances to h4, cramping black's position and preparing to open more lines for the attack. The rooks now swing into the battle. Tal brings his rook to h3, exchanges pawns in the center to open the e-file, and immediately plants a rook on e3, forcing Botvinnik's king to flee to d7. The attack is building momentum. The white knight leaps into the beautiful f4 square, eyeing the weak points in black's camp. The rook shifts over to b4, and Botvinnik is forced into a purely defensive posture, simply trying to hold on. And now another stroke of genius from Tal, the quiet queen to d1. This move looks so simple, but it is absolutely devastating. The deep idea is to prepare a sacrifice of the knight on g6, ripping open the cover around the black king for the final assault. Botvinnik is forced to eliminate the dangerous knight on f4. Tal recaptures with the rook, and black's own knight is forced back to g6 to defend. Unbelievable. A third brilliancy. Tal plays rook to d4, sacrificing the exchange to tear open the d-file and expose the black king once and for all. This is not about material. It's about pure attack. The black king has nowhere left to hide. And under this immense pressure, Botvinnik cracks. He captures the rook with check, which looks natural, but it actually simplifies white's task. The only way to survive was a quiet, difficult defensive move. The king had to step to c7. White would continue with pawn to g3, black could try to fight back with f4, and after the pawn captures, the king could try to escape to b7. But instead of that, Botvinnik snaps off the rook on e3 with check, and now Tal's pawn structure becomes a weapon in itself. The f-pawn recaptures on e3, creating a formidable pawn chain. Black's king finally steps to c7, but it's far too late. Tal pushes his c-pawn to c4, breaking down the last defensive barriers, and that is the final mistake. Botvinnik captures the pawn on c4, but this just opens the position for white's bishop to join the attack. The last chance was to create some chaos with pawn to f4, but now the position is completely collapsing. Tal's bishop swoops in to c4. After the queen moves to g7, the bishop simply captures the rook on g8, winning a decisive amount of material, and the game is over. The position is utterly won, and Tal plays a move to restrict the knight. It's perfectly fine, but the engine finds an even more crushing and direct path to victory. Queen to di3 was the knockout blow. If the knight takes on h4, the bishop simply recaptures. After queen takes g2, white's queen would land on f5, and it's all over. In the game, though, Tal pushes the pawn to h5, a practical move that seals the deal, even if it wasn't the absolute fastest. A signature performance from the magician from Riga, 3 brilliant sacrifices, a relentless attack, and pure tactical genius that completely overwhelmed the great Mikhail Botvinnik. Facing an unstoppable onslaught, Botvinnik resigned. A stunning victory for Mihail Tal.